Hello everyone and welcome to a game so many of you have requested before it even finished. It's Alexander Grischuk versus Maxime Vachier Lagrave from round 11 of the 2021 Candidates Tournament, and it's quite an impressive one. Again, Grischuk strikes with e4 and Maxime goes for his Sicilian, but this time it's a little bit different. So let's see what happens here. Grischuk with the white pieces opens with e4. We have c5 by Maxime, like we said, going for his Sicilian defense, and now knight to c3, already a surprise on move 2, opting for the closed Sicilian. We have d6 by Maxime, and now striking in the center with d4. So still opening up the position, but now the queen will recapture on d4. So c captures, queen captures, and now knight to c6, attacking the queen. And this is nothing new, this has been played many times. Bishop to b5, one of the options, pinning that knight, but queen to d2, more popular one. So g6, preparing to fianchetto the dark square bishop, and b3, as the queen is in the way of the dark square bishop, you want to place it to b2 and then continue your game. We have f4, bishop to h6. Now you could develop the bishop, sorry about that, you could develop the bishop to g7, but bishop to h6 kind of forces white's reply, because if you move the queen, then bishop captures and c1 comes in, it kind of ruins white's plans. And even though in most lines of the Sicilian, the Pir's defense or something like that, where black will fianchetto the dark square bishop, it's in white's interest to trade off the dark square bishops, but here it would go in black's favor. So here f4 as planned, knight to f6 now, and the bishop to b2. We have e5, striking in the center right away, and now there are 17 games in the database where this exact same position has been reached, even in extremely top tier games, and the g3 was the move that was played here exclusively. But here we have knight g to e2 by Grischuk, and it is already as of move 9 that we have a completely new game. So let's see how Maxime deals with this. He castles king side and Sasha castles queen side. So as you can imagine, or if you might, have seen the previous video that I've shown, when players castle on opposite sides of the board, all hell can break loose. So here, bishop to e6, continuing development, and now a nice prophylactic king to b1. You do not want your queen and king on this diagonal while this bishop is on h6, so king to b1 definitely makes sense. And now a5, striking on the queen side. a4 can come at any moment, and then black might, consider sacrificing some material. So here a4, Grischuk doesn't allow that, and now queen to b6. A slight improvement to queen to b6 is maybe knight to b4. Knight to g4, because it not only does it threaten knight to f2, which would attack both rooks, but also prevents white from just freely starting to attack the black's king side. So it would take you a few moves to consolidate here, and you don't have time with h3, like I said, knight f2, and then you're going to play queen to b6 and so on. But okay, here he went immediately for queen to b6, and now Sasha doesn't have to wait, he starts attacking on the king side. So h4, we have rook 8 to c8, and now h5, advancing that pawn all the way. We have knight captures on h5, and now g3. For the moment, you don't really gain anything with this rook sacrifice. I know a lot of you want to grab this knight with the rook, but after g captures, you don't really have f5 or anything. There's still the queen on d2. That's the problem. So instead, we have g3, playing this very slow, and now knight to b4. Kind of saying, okay, this knight is never leaving this c3 square, otherwise rook captures on c2 is coming. So here, bishop to h3, now preparing to grab the bishop on e6. And here, while you could consider not capturing on h3, let's say you play rook to c3, and then after captures, you might consider bringing this rook over to c8. Maxime just goes bishop captures on h3, we have rook captures, and now bishop back to g7. Another thing you might consider is queen to f2, kind of stifle white's counterplay on the king side, not allow this knight to move anywhere, and like we said, this knight can't move, so queen to f2, definitely a move to be considered. But like I said, bishop to g7 was played, and now Sasha just starts pushing his pawns, so g4. And here he asks a question whether or not Maxime wants to grab the f4 pawn, and here in the live coverage they've shown a very interesting line. It doesn't work, but it's still interesting. For example, if knight captures on f4, knight captures and e captures, then we can sacrifice the rook. Rook captures on h7, king captures on h7, now rook to h1 with check, king goes back, and queen to h2. So this is all very nice. We're threatening checkmate. And now, if black makes room for the king, let's say rook to e8, now the king can go to f8, now we simply win the game. Knight to d5, attacking black's queen, and the knight also opening up this diagonal. And now the point is, if knight captures on d5, we have this amazing queen to h8 check, and that's it. Only one move left for black, bishop captures, and rook captures on h8 will be checkmate. So while this is a very nice idea, after this check and queen to h2, black can simply play f6, and he has the f7 square. There's no checkmate, there's no anything here for white. But it is very interesting, so there you have it. So instead we have knight back to f6, although you could capture. Maxime senses that there definitely is danger there. So knight to f6, and now g5. We have knight back to h5. Here you could even capture on e4. And then just, I mean, that's kind of what you were playing for. If knight captures on e4, knight captures on e4, then we can play rook captures on c2. And then, of course, you're not going to give up the queen, but you can move the queen to e1, and then the game continues. Queen to c6, maybe bring the other rook into the game. Looks very interesting, but again, it's a completely crazy position. Anything can happen here. But instead, after this g5 move, we have knight to h5. Now, trying to dare Grischuk into capturing this knight, and while you could do this, again, it might be a bit too soon. Captures and f5, you always have to deal with this queen to f2 move, simply paralyzing all of your counterplay, and even if f6, you can bring the bishop back, nothing really happening here. For example, queen captures on d6, this is good, because if any rook attacks it, you're just going to capture it and checkmate the black king, because the pawns are nicely covering the e7 and g7 squares, but now we might do something like h4, we start pushing our pass pawn, and it's still a game, it's being played. But Grischuk goes for something that's even stronger, and instead of just grabbing here, he pushes f5, and now Maxime really has to figure out how to defend this position. So he starts by rook f to d8, definitely makes sense, defends the d6 pawn, and also gives his king a little more breathing room. And the situation on the clock is 28 minutes for Grischuk and 45 minutes for Maxime. So not that great for Grischuk, as it's only move 20, but Grischuk is used to that. And here we have f6, going after that bishop. Another move you might consider is something like queen to a1, trying to bring the queen into the attack. And also bishop to a3 seems reasonable. If the knight ever moves, then you can attack this very nicely, but also you can just eliminate this knight, and then you no longer have to worry about this knight attacking the c2 pawn. But there's time for that. We have f6, bishop to f8, and now comes knight to g3, asking, do you want to trade knights? Because then if captures, I can just shift the rooks over to the h file, and the black might have a very clever defense. For example, h5, and then if g captures on h5 en passant, then king to h7. Sorry, on h6, then king to h7, and you sort of use white's own pawns as a shield. Whether this would work or not, it's hard to say. It would be a very, very interesting game. But okay, here Maxime decided to counter, not with this sneaky idea, but rather with d5 right away, opening up the d file. We have e captures on d5, and only now knight captures on d3. Rook captures and h5 now, and now it's very interesting. But now I think that Grischuk missed a g captures on h6, because here it's a little bit stronger. Point is that now if you go king to h7, then knight to e4, and you're just getting destroyed here. Knight to g5 is coming, so it's a bit of a different line. And if you don't go king to h7, if you go queen captures on f6, then again rook to h3, you threaten to push the pawn, and if king to h7, knight e4 is again extremely strong, just attacking the queen, coming to g5. And that's pretty much it. Queen f5, knight check, you're gonna go somewhere, h7 check, king h8, rook to f3 is coming, and that's it. Once the queen moves, knight captures, and that's it. So it's a bit of a different position than going for this h5 idea in the position that we've already shown. But okay, here he goes queen to e2, and now rook to c5, adding another attacker to the d5 pawn, also preparing to double up on the c file. Rook to h3, now preparing to sacrifice some material here, and knight captures on d5 now. We have knight captures, rook c captures on d5, and now rook d to h1. So what do you do here? Queen to d6, tripling up here on the d file, preparing rook to d1 check. And here, while you could go for rook captures on h5, it's not as potent because then rook to d1 check. You have to play king to a2, and then, for example, g captures, you have to play something like rook to h3. Or something like that. You don't really have the option of doing anything. Rook captures on h5 doesn't really do anything. So here, if you go rook to h3 with the idea of capturing and delivering checkmate, then we have this rook to a1 check. This is how black goes about this. Bishop captures and queen to d1. Now you either trade queens or you're never grabbing that pawn as the queen defends it. And here after captures, and captures, we would have this position where white is up a pawn. It's a nice position, but hard to imagine you would be able to push for a win here. So instead, after queen to d6, Grischuk goes for the king to a2 move right away. He keeps his options open, doesn't just grab anything, and now rook to d1. And only now rook captures on h5. We have g captures on h5, and now Grischuk doesn't repeat the line that we've shown, rook to h3 followed by rook to a1 check. Instead, after this g captures on h5, he just plays rook captures on h5. And now what do you play here? Problem is, if you try something like rook to d2, queen e4, and white wins. It's that simple. So here, instead, after rook to d2, you have to guard against queen to e4. We have rook to d4, offering the rook up for a bishop, but white is not interested in giving up this very strong attacker. So here we have rook back to h1, now preparing queen to h5, queen h7 checkmate, and here a nice rook captures on a4. And this is just a very sneaky idea, because if the rook is captured, then queen to d4, the d5 with check, picks up the rook on h1, white's attack is over, and black just wins the game. So instead, after rook captures, Grischuk just goes back, king to b1, and now queen to d5, centralizing, attacking the rook on h1, queen to h5, and now how do you defend checkmate? There's only one move, and this is what Maxime goes for. Queen captures on h1. Very nicely done. The move from the thumbnail is on the board. We have queen captures on h1, and now rook to g4. And here we have two rooks and a bishop against a queen and a bishop, and this is pretty much enough to play for a draw. We have bishop captures on e5, grabbing the e5 pawn, and now rook captures on g5. Rather than capturing right away, you might consider just defending this pawn, or even pushing to b5. Maybe you create a pass pawn here. Also an idea, but this is already move 36, and we need to reach time control. So here rook g5, queen captures on b7, a very important pawn to grab, and now rook to d2. So here Maxime does have a lot of attacking potential. He can use his rooks to go after this pawn here, but the white's dark square bishop will do a fine job of defending against any checkmate threats. So here, bishop to c3, attacking the rook. A nice idea here would have been bishop to f4. You don't win a rook, but for example, after rook to g1 check, king b2, and now rook to e2, getting the rooks out of the way, queen to a8 is just deadly. How do you defend against just a double attack here? You can't move the king, otherwise you lose the bishop, so it's a very interesting idea. Point is that he was probably worried about this, and he didn't have enough time to calculate what happens here, but you will be able to run away. For example, rook captures on c2 check, king to d3, rook c to f2, and as there is no check, the bishop is covering this square, but now we just play bishop h6, and this is how we win material. Rook g3 check, king e4, and after, let's say, anything, there are no more useful checks here. Rook captures on f6, we're just gonna capture here on f8, and now we have more than enough material to win the game. So after rook d2, bishop f4, definitely a good move, but okay, bishop to c3 was played. Better safe than sorry, and rook to e2 now. The rook is coming to g2 either way, so here we have queen to c8, and now comes rook to g1 with check. King to g2, king to b2, and only now rook g to g2, going after the c2 pawn, and this is move 40 by both white and black. We've reached time control, and now it's time to relax and find all the greatest moves. So here bishop captures on a5, and of course rook captures on c2 with check, grabbing that queen. You had to do this, there was no other way. So queen captures on c2, and now comes rook captures on c2. And this was the position that was very much discussed, and even I think Chess24 tweeted about how bishop to a3 might have saved the game. And while it might have, it doesn't seem that it would have, because if bishop to a3 check, of course, white doesn't capture. After king to b1, for example, rook captures on c2, king captures, and now king f8. Point was that after this bishop moves, you gain an additional tempo for the black king, so you can start advancing your king here. But it is not enough. For example, king to c3, king to e8. Now you're going to play bishop to b4, force the bishop to move, otherwise you're just up a pawn in a completely winning game. Bishop c1, king to c4, you're going to play king to d7, and now king to b5. White is much faster. Bishop to g5, attacking the pawn here, but bishop to e7. And now after king to e6, if you try and go after this pawn, it doesn't really work, but it doesn't matter. Even if you try and defend, we can even show, for example, if you go somewhere up the board, then the white king advances. But if you try and trade this, again, it doesn't work. Just b4, we can trade here, white king moves, and now, of course, the white pawn is much faster. And even if you don't do this, like I said, if you go king to c8, it's still just, king to c6, and now the pawn just advances. There's nothing you can do here. You can never block along this diagonal because the bishop just blocks that bishop, so it's always in white's interest to trade, and this is just winning. But okay, here rook captures on c2 was played. Doesn't really change things. King captures on c2, and now king to h7. And now feel free to pause the video and try to find the winning plan for white while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on not playing anything weird like king to c1. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, it's king to d3. Not only king to d3, you could also play bishop to d8, try to get the bishop here. You could also play bishop to c3. A lot of moves are interesting, but king to d3 is very much straightforward, and this is, of course, now winning. The only move you don't do here is b4. b4 is just bad because then you really allow king to g6, and now it doesn't really matter what you play, because if you go bishop to d8 to defend the pawn, then you lose this pawn. And if you don't do this, if you try something like b5, advancing your passed pawn, then just king captures on f6, and it's really no problem stopping this pawn. King e6 here, and then just bishop to d6, and you don't have any good ways of, well, doing anything here. It's just a draw. So congratulations to everyone that did not want to push this pawn to b4, even though in most cases pawn to b4 is a great move, but here it's not. So here king d3, we have king to g6, and now bishop to c3, for the moment defending this pawn. King to f5, now comes king to c4, and now king to e6. We have b4 now, starting to advance the pawn, bishop to d6, and here Grischuk just went b5, and it was in this position on move 48 that Maxime Vachier Lagrave resigned the game, as there is nothing more to be done here. So really tough second half of the tournament for Maxime. He was leading after the first half of the tournament, but then I guess he didn't really enjoy this a whole year break from the candidates, and he can't really catch his rhythm. But it's really different because he came as a substitute for Temur Rajabov, and he really came without much preparation, but now he kind of had a whole year to prepare, so it's a bit of a different thing, because, if you don't perform, then you always think you could have, studied better, prepared for the tournament better. But this way, when he was just a substitute for Rajabov, he didn't really have a lot of time, so he just came and he played really well. Not that he's not playing well now, it's just that he's not, converting all of his, for example, black plays with the Sicilian. I believe this is his third loss already. But yeah, here we resign because there's just nothing you can do about this pawn. You could just push this bishop back and forth, but doesn't really help. King c5, you're going to push the bishop back, king to c6, bishop e8, b6, and that's just it. Bishop to d6, you're going to play b7, and if bishop here, now you're just going to play bishop to b4. You don't really care about this pawn anymore, because then bishop to d6 wins. For example, bishop a7, of course you're not going to trade, and then after king to b5, king to e6, just king to a6. And now you either move the bishop and then we promote the pawn. If you go here, then we capture it. And of course, if you trade, then we're just much faster. You can push f5, but then this comes with check, and that's just it. And even if you don't do this, for example, after bishop to b4, you don't have to capture the pawn. You could just start moving with the bishop. Doesn't really help. For example, you could play something like, or you could even, yeah, okay, we showed that line. You could capture the pawn, but then bishop to d6 is just enough, and we go into a pretty similar line: bishop a7, king b5, and that's it. If king e6, again, we play this king to a6 move, and that's it. Not much to worry about. King captures, king captures, and after f5, now again this comes with check. Or rather, I think, I think that's the line that we've already shown. We have to show what happens if you don't capture the f6 pawn. After bishop to g3, now we play bishop to a5, and then we threaten this, so bishop has to go back. We go bishop to c7, and now after bishop to a7, now it's the same line. Sorry about that. King b5, and that's it. King d7, king a6, we don't care about our bishop. Captures, and that's it. Next move, we queen with check. So really weird. You guys were probably like, what's just happening? We just saw that line. Yeah, life is weird like that. But yeah, that's the game. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Really awesome stuff for Grischuk. And what does this mean for the standings? Well, we're probably going to show one more game, and then we're going to discuss the standings. But I will just say that Anish Giri is the one that's now has the most chances of dethroning Yanni Pomnishi from being the leader of the candidates tournament, but he still has well, 3 very important rounds. Giri still needs to face Caruana, Grischuk, and Alexeyenko to try and overcome Jan's lead. But we'll see what happens. 3 round is a lifetime in the candidate, so we'll see what happens. So yeah, once again, hope you guys enjoyed it. I would like to thank Edmund Freeman, Vladu Laru, Raymond Zhao, David Kimura, and Lucas Berlund for a contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot, I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon. Continuing the coverage of the candidates, checking up on your wonderful suggestions, and do whatever else happens in the chess world. Thank you all, I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.